This is the smallest of the world religions that we'll be studying this semester. This religion is Jain Dharma, and it's just one lecture.
Okay, your primary teacher that you need to know for Jain Dharma is Mahavira, and he is part of the Kshatriya caste of Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism. As a man at about 30 years of age, Mahavira is determined to try to find a life that has more meaning, and he is very much inspired by the local sannyasin. Just to remind you, the sannyasin is the oldest life stage within the Hindu tradition, and it's where you renounce all of your possessions and you live as a homeless individual and you meditate with the hope of achieving enlightenment. And so Mahavira does this at age 30, and as he meditates and attempts to commit himself to the spiritual disciplines of the sannyasin, he is ridiculed by others. They think he is quite foolish that he had been part of such a high caste, being royalty or nobility with the Kshatriya group, that they will pull his hair, they will spit upon him, anything to try to disrupt his meditation. But he continues along this path until at age 42 he comes to a moment of enlightenment, and we'll talk about the content of that enlightenment in just a moment. But the last thing that you need to be sure to take from this slide is the term Tirthankara, because within the Jain tradition, the belief is that there have been 24 very wise teachers that have been provided to the human community around this area of India. And the 23 Tirthankaras that came before Mahavira demonstrated their teaching and helped to establish community. And then Mahavira is understood as the founder of Jain Dharma because he is the final Tirthankara, the 24th and final Tirthankara, and he is the one that brings finality to the teachings of Jain Dharma. It is somewhat of a pessimistic religion because the belief that took place with enlightenment was that the creation, the entire cosmos, is in a downward cycle. And so the very severe spiritual disciplines of Jain Dharma are a recognition that the world is in this downward cycle. And through the suffering and the self-sacrifice that comes with these religious disciplines, the belief is that one is preparing oneself for the end of this cycle in the cosmos and the beginning of a new one. Now, Mahavira has primary groups of followers, and you see both of them pictured here. The group on the inside that is committed to absolute nakedness, no possessions at all, not even clothing. This group is called the Digambaras, and the Digambaras are a male group, strictly male group within the Jain tradition. And as you can probably see by the numbers here, they are the smallest group. The much larger group is the Svetambaras, and they you see wearing the white robes, and this is open to both men and women. And again, it's the much larger tradition. It's not as severe as the Digambaras. And then please notice that behind the religious, which are the monks and the nuns here, we do have the laity. So there are members of the Jain tradition that don't necessarily belong to one of these two groups, but still follow the traditions and help to support the monks and nuns within the Digambara and Svetambara traditions. Now here's how we come to the division within Jain Dharma. After the death of Mahavira, the primary leader is his follower Bhadrabahu, and they're all living together in a village called Bihar in northeast India. And Bhadrabahu has an enlightenment experience that communicates that there's going to be a severe famine and drought in that area, and so he determines that the community should move away. But most of the Jains are reluctant to do this, but many who do feel that Bhadrabahu is the one selected by Mahavira to lead the community do leave Bihar with him. And after 12 years, they return, and they discover that there have been some changes made by those who remain behind. Bhadrabahu and his group are what we call the Digambaras, that remained in the most severe form of Jain Dharma. The commitment to absolute nakedness is probably the most stark example of that. But while they were gone in those dozen years, the Svetambaras changed some of the rules. Things became less severe, and certainly the best example of that is the allowance of wearing the white robe and the inclusion, of course, of women. The Digambaras and Svetambaras, even though they have this disagreement, they do get along with one another quite well, as you can see the community gathered together here. And let me tell you one story that will show why the two are able to get along with one another. The very first Tirthankara, remember there's 24 of them. You don't have to know his name, but I'll give it to you just for the sake of the story. His name was Rishabha. And Rishabha was married to one woman with whom he had 99 sons. I know what you're thinking, poor woman, 99 sons. And he's married to another woman with whom he has just the one son. And the one son is named Bahubali, and the oldest of the 99 sons is called Bharat. And Bharat comes up with the idea that as inheritance is about to be made, that all of his brothers should simply give their land to him and let him rule over all of them. And the 98 brothers that are full-blooded brothers to Bharat, they feel threatened by the power that their brother has, and they're not brave enough to stand up to him. So they tend to be in agreement that they will give their land over to their brother. But Bahubali, who's only a half-brother, he says, well, why can't you just have your land and it be yours, and I can have my land and it will be mine, and we don't need to all be under your control. And so the way the issue is going to be resolved is that there is going to be a 3-round contest between the two brothers, and whoever wins these 3 contests will win the argument. The very first contest is a staring contest. Whoever blinks first will lose, and Bharat blinks first, so he's lost round 1. The second round of this contest is a wrestling match under the water, and Bahubali is once again able to get his brother Bharat to submit, so he's won the first 2 rounds, which brings us to our final round, which is a contest of wrestling on the ground this time. And the name Bahubali, what it means actually kind of gives the story away here. Bahubali means the one who has very strong arms. And Bahubali is able to lift his brother Bharat over his head, making him the seeming winner of this last contest. But Bahubali, as he holds his brother over his head, becomes frozen and cannot move. And eventually the other brothers come along and take Bharat down from his brother's arms, and Bahubali remains frozen there for many, many years. Vegetation starts to grow up around him. Snakes make their home around his feet. And the reason that he has become frozen is because as soon as he held his brother over his head, the thought came to him that I am not standing on my own land. Okay, this land is not really my land. And remember, that is what the entire contest had been about. Well, finally, when Bharat is informed that this was what froze his brother, Bharat also realizes that he was wrong to demand that all of his brothers give him their land, that each person should have their own, and not their own in a selfish way, but their own in order to share with one another and help provide for one another. And so Bharat approaches his frozen brother Bahubali after many years, and a forgiveness is achieved that unfreezes Bahubali, and everyone now has their own land, but again, not in a selfish way, in a way of sharing with one another in community. And so the story of Bharat versus Bahubali is sometimes seen as the story of the Digambaras versus the Svetambaras. And just as Bahubali and Bharat come together in unity, so too can these two groups of Jains come together. Okay, this is an important slide, and I realize if you've looked at the image already, you probably see a symbol that is disturbing to you. The Nazi Party of Germany did not develop the swastika symbol. They actually stole that symbol from Eastern religions and used it as their political party's primary symbol. But I hope you can maybe be educated here to understand that the swastika is not synonymous with the Nazi tradition, and certainly not that fascist form of political philosophy. But instead, the swastika was initially an Eastern religious symbol and still employed by the Jains, and it represents the cyclical nature of reality, because if you look at the swastika, you can see how it is a very balanced symbol, and you can almost picture it beginning to move around in a circle like the hands of a clock, and it's just saying that all of creation repeats itself cyclically over and over and over again. And the 4 dots within the swastika represent the 4 seasons. The 3 dots represent the virtues of insight and knowledge and conduct. And again, I know this is a lot of information, but for testing purposes, the one that I would like you to be able to realize here is that the little crescent that you see at the very top is sort of the separation of the physical reality and reaching a state of perfection. And what that one dot above the crescent represents is the soul that has come to enlightenment. And the soul that has come to enlightenment or salvation within the Jain tradition is called the jiva or the jivatma. So the jiva is synonymous with what we had for Atman within the Hindu tradition. And here at the very bottom of the slide, you can see one of the primary virtues of Jain Dharma being expressed. The open hand is saying that I'm not going to make a fist and strike you. I will have no violence against you. But instead, this open hand represents an absolute commitment to nonviolence or pacifism. And our term for that, you can see toward the very bottom of this slide, is ahimsa. Now I want to unpack a little bit more on this slide before I return to ahimsa, because I'm going to want to slow down just a little bit before we finish up on this slide. But just some other terms so you can see how similar this religious tradition is to Sanatana Dharma. We had the release of the Atman was called moksha within Sanatana Dharma. Well, that release to a perfected state is called kavala, which you can see in parentheses here on the last bullet. So kavala would be when your jiva is released from the body. The Atman is the soul is released from the body, and when the jiva achieves that freedom or liberty, that state of perfection is called kavala. And a person that attains that highest state of consciousness, that place of enlightenment, that person is called a jina. And it's from the word Jina that we get the term Jain. You can tell that it's just a movement of a couple of the letters around there, but that is how we come to the term Jain Dharma. It is the religion of the Jinas, those who have become enlightened. Okay, and there's a different understanding of karma within this religion. There is the belief in karma, but all karma within Jain Dharma is bad karma, because if you are overly obsessed with your own karma, that's seen as a very self-centered action. So it doesn't matter whether it's a good action or a bad action. If you're so focused upon you and what you're doing, you're so self-centered that you cannot live for others in community the way that you should. And so within the Jain tradition, karma is seen as very small particles that actually cling to the body and weigh the body down and keep you from achieving that state of perfection or kavala. So all karma is bad, and only when you let go of karma do you have salvation take place. Okay, now here's where I do want to slow down a little bit, because I do think this is a difficult part of the class because of new vocabulary. And so let's go back to this term ahimsa at the bottom, and you can see that there are two other terms that start with the letter A here. And so this is what I think is tough. You've got three new terms here. They all begin with the letter A, so they can look similar, and you're going to need to be able to distinguish between them. And here's why I really slow down here. When we get to the religion of Buddha Dharma, which the next two lectures will be about, there is a similar outlook about the nature of life, and there will be two more new words that start with the letter A then. So I would highly recommend that somewhere in your notes you number 1 through 5 and kind of draw a line under number 3 and say, okay, these three ideas or concepts belong to Jain Dharma. And then on number 4 and 5, when we get to the Buddha Dharma lectures, you'll want to say these two belong to Buddha Dharma. And then when you're studying for the test, you want to make sure that you can distinguish between what these 5 words mean. Now the first one, ahimsa, is pretty easy. Just that commitment to nonviolence or pacifism. I think that that's pretty easy to understand. But the next two can be a bit difficult. Aparigraha, okay, aparigraha, and this deals with the simplicity of the life of Jain Dharma, in which you learn not to be overly attached to things, whether that's material things or people, that you learn to have a proper relationship with all people and all things. And aparigraha saying don't be overly attached, and also don't try to accumulate too many things. Try to live as simply as possible. Okay, so that's a parigraha, non-attachment, and not trying to acquire too many things. Okay, and then lastly, if you all will remember from the previous lecture on Sanatana Dharma, the story about the blind man and the elephant, that story also relates to Jain Dharma, and this last word here, anekantwad. And anekantwad is the virtue of non-absolutism. Okay, non-absolutism. And what I mean by that is that you would never take your experience or your understanding of truth and claim that that is the one and only absolute truth. Okay, so a nekantwad is being humble about your religious convictions and what you believe to be true, that you would have the realization that that is your experience and your understanding, but you will be humble enough that you will not claim that it is the only truth or the absolute truth. So ahimsa is nonviolence, a parigraha is non-attachment, and a nekantwad is non-absolutism. Okay, some of our primary vows and practices within Jain Dharma. The story of Bahubali makes him a very revered figure within this religious tradition, and worship will often take place. Sorry, I misspoke there. Not so much worship, but let's go with the term reverence. And you see that listed here on the third bullet, because that is a really important distinction to make about this religion, because there is the belief in gods, in divine beings, but worshiping them is something to be avoided. And what I mean by reverence instead of worship is that you look at the gods as models that you imitate. Okay, they are revered rather than worshipped. And here's a distinction I can make for many of you, because those who come outside of the Catholic Church often misunderstand the role of Mary and the saints. Prayers are offered to Mary and the saints within the Catholic tradition, but this is not the worship of Mary or the saints. It is reverence for them because they represent a life to model your life after. And that is the same view that we would have here of Bahubali or the other, quote, saints of the Jain tradition, is they are gods, not in the sense that you worship them, but you show them reverence. And one way of showing this reverence is to take small pieces of gold leaf and to press those into the toes, into the feet of Bahubali or another Jain statue, and that is a way of saying, I am going to emulate you. I am going to base my life upon your life. Some of the disciplines that are practiced here, meditation, very important for just about every religious tradition. And if you're Jain laity, not a religious, you can certainly be married and have a family, but if you're a monk or nun, you're committed to celibacy and poverty. By the way, Jain laity are some of the wealthiest people in the world, but they give the vast majority of their wealth away to the monks and the nuns so that they can sustain their lives, and also to other charities. Jains live a very disciplined life, and because of that, they're often able to gain great wealth. But again, with what we saw with parigraha on the previous slide, there is this dedication to simplicity. You don't use the wealth to buy a lot of things. And let me say just a bit about this reverence for all of life that you see listed as a discipline here. Sometimes you will see a Jain monk or nun walking around with a very small broom, and they will stoop down and they will sweep the ground in front of them before they walk. The belief here is that there are very small organisms that are there on the ground, and if they step on those organisms, they could kill them. Well, those organisms are life, and so that would be a terrible thing to do. So the broom is intended to protect the life of those small bugs or other life forms that may be there. You get them out of the way so you don't step on them. And the other example is think of the mask that many folks with allergies will wear if they're doing yard work so that the allergies don't get stirred up. You'll see many Jains wear that same kind of mask when they're outside, no matter what they're doing. The belief being that there are small organisms in the air, and if they were to breathe those organisms in through their nostrils or their mouth, they would be harming and killing those organisms, and so the mask keeps them from being inhaled. Of course, Bahir is the primary holy city and a place that pilgrimages are made to. And of course, we I think you heard me say with the pessimistic view about where creation is going, the holy days for Jain Dharma are very somber. These are more days about austerity and quietness, and certainly not celebration, but you're preparing yourself for this downward cycle that the world is in. And so the holy days are intended to humble you, and again are very somber, very austere days. Okay, and because it is such a strict religion, Jain Dharma is the smallest of the Eastern religions, of any religion that we study this semester. I know 6 million sounds like a big number, but when we have 7 billion people on the earth, I think you can see that it's not that large of a number. But the 6 million Jains throughout the world today, and the vast majority of these Jains continue to live in northeast India. Pictured here is Sri Chitrabhanu, and he is somewhat the very first Jain missionary, in that Jain Dharma has never before sought to make converts, to get people to change to its religion. But Sri Chitrabhanu did go and speak at a World Council of Religions, and it was, in a way, sort of the first time that some people had heard of this tradition and got to hear from it from an insider perspective, because Chitrabhanu certainly is a Jain himself. There was great interest in this religion because of how disciplined it is, and yes, it is very severe. But because of that discipline, it has now traveled around the world, and especially on the East Coast, we do have some Jain communities that are doing quite well. And because they have done well, even though they're not growing nearly as quickly as Sanatana Dharma or Buddha Dharma adherents, it is still a growing religion today, but just in very small increments.